Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. I'm David Ferriero. I'm the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here. Whether you're here in person or joining us on our YouTube channel, I'd like to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater. Tonight's program, Shared Legacies, Honoring the Black-Jewish Civil Rights Alliance, examines the important and supportive bond between Jewish and Black activists during the Civil Rights Movement. I'd like to thank our partners, the 2016 March on Washington Film Festival, and also give a special welcome to the eminent group of civil rights icons, scholars, and theologians assembled tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about a program that will be coming up in this theater in August. On Thursday, August 25th at noon, we will continue our commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service with From the Vaults, the National Park Service on film, featuring archival footage from the holdings of the National Archives. To learn more about this and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it by regular mail or email. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of the work of the agency in education and outreach programs, and there are applications for membership also in the lobby. And a little known fact that I keep sharing with everyone, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation. And in fact, our executive director, our president, our chair is sitting here right there. Alelia Bundles is the head of the National Archives Foundation. The records in the National Archives document the story of America, and part of that story reflects the changes in how we have defined citizenship. The starting point in the story is our Constitution, which is on permanent display with the Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence in the rotunda one floor above us. The Amending America exhibit in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery teaches us how, starting 225 years ago, the Bill of Rights and subsequent amendments set the stage for expanding and securing individual rights. More of the story is told in the Records of Rights exhibit on the ground floor and online at archives.gov. But the items showcased in our exhibits are just the starting point. The story of the struggle for civil rights in America can be found in the records we hold here in the Washington area and the National Archives facilities and presidential libraries across the country. Among the federal court records, one can find arrest records and testimony of civil rights icons such as Rosa Parks and John Lewis, and groundbreaking decisions made by the Supreme Court and lower courts. Among the records of Congress are petitions, resolution, and legislation concerning the limitation or protection of civil rights. And our extensive motion picture and photograph collections can take us into the moment and allow us to witness significant episodes of the civil rights movement firsthand. By preserving our nation's documentary heritage, we ensure that the stories of our struggles, our successes and failures will not be forgotten. We're presenting tonight's program in partnership with the 2016 March on Washington Film Festival, and we are pleased to welcome them back after last year's very successful Writers and Scholars Roundtable on Civil Rights. The festival is the production of the Rabin Group, and it's now my pleasure to turn the program over to its president and founder, Robert Rabin. Before founding the Rabin Group in 2002, Robert served as counsel for Congressman Barney Frank and later served as Assistant Attorney General for Legislative Affairs during the Clinton administration. While at the Department of Justice, Robert drove Attorney General Janet Reno's legislative initiatives and handled the political challenges of congressional oversight of the department. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert Rabin.
Thank you very much, Archivist Ferriero, for having us back. It's an honor and a treat to be at this important institution. I also want to thank Dr. Alelia Bundles, who's waving. We literally would not be here without her. It was her idea several years ago to co-join the festival and the National Archives, and we deeply appreciate that. We are on day 8 of a 10-day festival, 17 events, Tomorrow afternoon at the Smithsonian, we'll have a fantastic conversation with Dr. Clarence Jones and Rabbi Ben Kamin. It's the third in this series of Jewish Americans and the Civil Rights Movement. You can look at marchonwashington.com, marchonwashington.org, or the Smithsonian website for information. Tickets are still available. It'll be a terrific program. Our festival was formed as a national platform to give people with direct experience and stories from the classic civil rights movement in this nation an unfiltered opportunity to talk to us about the facts. Our history in this country is frequently mistold, sometimes on purpose. The National Archives is doing its part to correct the record and make available to Americans the truth, and this festival is doing its part. And tonight we have a paradigmatic example of that. We have a group of individuals who were there, not just there, but leading, and it's going to be a very, very rich evening, and I'm particularly excited about it. I'll tell you just the run of show quickly. We will screen a fantastic documentary, and immediately after that documentary, Deborah Lauter, who is the Senior Vice President at the Anti-Defamation League and a longtime champion of civil rights, will come to the stage and introduce the panel. We'll learn more about her and the panel. But now I'd like to do two things. One, of course, thank our funders and sponsors. They're in your program book. These programs are offered free to the public, and they are generously supported by foundations and individuals. And I'd like to welcome our new sponsor tonight, the Anti-Defamation League. Thank you very much. And now it's my privilege to introduce the perfect person to kick off tonight's program. He inspires us with his words, with his acting, with his actions. A few nights ago in a documentary about Maya Angelou, he came on the screen and talked to us about his relationship with her and how together they had moved artistry and civil rights. He's an Academy Award winner. He's charming, he's funny, he's smart. Louis Gossett, Jr.
Thank you very much. When Dr. King was arrested in Birmingham on April 12th, 1963, he was put into a very small cell, but he couldn't reach. But he was accused of being an extremist by the clergymen of Birmingham, and one of his visitors, Dr. Jones, would pick up pieces of paper that he would write and bring him pieces of paper that he would write. And these are excerpts, letters from the Birmingham jail, written by Dr. Martin Luther King. It's letters to his fellow clergymen. My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day. And I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill, and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statements in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, purification, and direct action. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself, and that is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom, and something within and without has reminded him that it can be gained. Consciously and unconsciously, he has been caught up by the zeitgeist. And with his black brothers of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers of Asia and South America and the Caribbean, the United States Negro is moving with a sense of great urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this normal and healthy discontent can be channeled into the creative outlet of non-violence, direct action. And now, this approach is now being termed extremist. Is it initially disappointing to be categorized as an extremist as I continued to think about the matter? I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise, so help me God. And John Bunyan, I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. And Abraham Lincoln, this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So, the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? Before the pen of Jefferson etched the magical words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of the masses while suffering gross injustices and shameful humiliation. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith. I also hope that circumstances will not make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. Yours truly, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
Please don't give up on your dreams.
The closest persons in the United States with a shared history of the African American people, of the Jewish people. Not only should whites and Jewish people learn up close and personal about the experience of slavery, but those of us who have had that heritage, we need to learn up close and personal the experience that the Jewish people have had.
My father wrote a note to Dr. King. The day we marched together out of Selma was a day of sanctification.
There was passion from the prophets, passion from the Bible, from their religious spirit.
Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying.
In my mind, Martin Luther King was a king and is a king.
You love this country? You love Martin Luther King Jr.? Don't just love him, you got to do something about it. I want you to remember.
And a number of them went to jail with us.
Jews participated in the civil rights movement. That's like some abstract thing. No. I saw it. I felt it. I knew they were. I touched them.
And that's the importance of the alliance. We are concerned and must show concern for each other.
The relationship between blacks and Jews, if it's not talked about, if we don't see those images and pictures, if we don't hear the stories of these people so that they will learn and they will understand and they won't duplicate certain mistakes.
We have to reach out to the younger generation to teach them the lessons, help them understand what has occurred, how we got to where we are now.
History has sanitized and erased all that both of us are talking about.
Harriet Tubman, who freed many slaves, was referred to as Moses because Moses was the endearing symbol of freedom, of freeing the Hebrews out of Egyptian slavery.
The only thing that we should get together to pay attention and do what we're supposed to do for the salvation of us all. The ironic answer and solution, those who have been stepped upon have to lead the way.
As an African proverb, if the lions don't tell their stories, the hunters will get all the credit. So I'm telling you the story now. I'm telling you the story now because you're young lions and lionesses.
With this knowledge, with this understanding, with these experiences, we'll be able to spill the honey.
By bringing people together, there's a sweetness that spills over that will change the nastiness and the bitterness of racism and anti-Semitism. That's what Spilling the Honey really is about.
Spill the honey. I learned more in this about Martin Luther King in like 30 minutes in his relation with the Jewish community than I have in my entire career as a student.
We will not stand and sit silently, idly by. That's the lesson we learned from the Holocaust. That's the lesson we learned from the legacy of slavery.
Put your hands together and applaud all that God has done through you, with you, for our country.
The civil rights challenges of our time, the human rights challenges of our day, they hang on me. They hang on you. They hang on who? They hang on us.
Because they look at me as a beneficiary of the greatest apostle of the 20th century on the question of nonviolence, love, and anti-Semitism.
And I be smelling honey. Your love is sticking to me. So that pain and that darkness,
So as the panelists are gathering, I was thinking for a moment,
Oh, that's great stuff.
there's so much going on in this country right now. Like, you could have been in Cleveland for a big night in American history. You could have been at Comic-Con, right, in San Diego. But you chose to spill the honey with us this evening, and we are delighted. That was quite remarkable. The hugs you were seeing up here with Sherry Rogers, who produced this film. Sherry, why don't you take another? And this is just an excerpt. It's 45 minutes of what's going to be a much longer film, and I hope you agree with me that this was quite extraordinary. And for those who do this kind of business or are entrenched, there were so many images and themes in this movie that, Sherry, it's really kudos to you for bringing them to light. Clearly, when this series was planned, nobody could predict what was going on in this country, or what would be happening now. And there's been just so much tension and unrest. So to watch this, such an uplifting film, and to be able to explore some of the themes with the people that starred in this film and in fact have starred in American history is quite extraordinary. So I want to thank the March on Washington Film Festival, Robert Raymond, for providing this forum for us tonight. It's really quite exceptional. As Robert said, I'm Deborah Lauter. I'm Senior Vice President of the Anti-Defamation League. Over the past 10 years, I actually was head of our Civil Rights Division, and had the privilege to work with many of these individuals. I'm going to introduce our panel up here, and then many of the people you saw in the film are with us and are special guests. I'm going to introduce them as well, and I'm hoping we can engage them in the conversation tonight as well. So I'll introduce our panel just in alphabetical order. Right here to my right is Dr. Gerald Durley. I think you all saw his wit and his humor in the film. Dr. Durley served for 20 years as pastor of the historic Providence Missionary Baptist Church in Atlanta. 25, sorry, Dr. Durley. You should know that last Monday was Dr. Gerald Durley Day in Atlanta. Oh. So, yeah. And that really comes from the decades of this man's incredible leadership in civil rights, in human relations. I will just say quickly, I've had the privilege to travel with Dr. Durley in interfaith missions, and I need to recognize real quick also Imam Pliman El-Amim, who's with us in the audience. It was quite a surprise. The three of us traveled together. And, I want to introduce Rabbi Dresner. Rabbi Dresner, as you heard, was billed on the screen as the most arrested rabbi in America. That's quite a claim to fame. He was a close friend of Dr. King and clearly very instrumental in the civil rights movement. So we're thrilled that you could join us tonight, Rabbi. Thank you so much. Dr. Susannah Heschel. Dr. Heschel is the Eli Black Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College, and she's, as you saw in the film, she's the daughter of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. So we're thrilled that she's here tonight and give us more perspectives on her father. And last but certainly not least, we have C.T. Vivian. Dr. Vivian is a minister, author. He was a close friend and lieutenant of Martin Luther King Jr. He was the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Honor in 2013. And I want to read what the president said at that time. He said, C.T. Vivian was one of Dr. Martin Luther King's closest advisors. Martin taught us, he says, that it's in the action that we find out who we really are. And time and again, Reverend Vivian was among the first to be in the action. So we're thrilled that he's here, and I will tell you, in about 9 days, Dr. Vivian is going to be celebrating his 92nd birthday. Amazing, amazing. As I mentioned, we have special guests here in the audience, and you saw several of them on the film. Rabbi Ben Kamin, also a teacher, counselor, a scholar on Martin Luther King, and I believe he's doing a program as part of the film festival tomorrow. We have, you saw Dr. Clarence Jones, the intelligent, handsome man, where his wife's with him. So we're absolutely thrilled he's with us, and hopefully we'll get some discussion with him tonight as well. He's speechwriter, attorney, personal advisor to Dr. King. He actually drafted the first, is it 7 paragraphs of the I Have a Dream speech. So, and we have also, this is incredible, you met Dr. Rogers. Again, kudos on this amazing, amazing documentary. And finally, Rabbi Jonah Dov-Pesner, who you saw give the incredible blessing to Clarence. That was really quite a moving part of the film. So actually, I think what I'd like to do real quickly, Rabbi, I know you had some prepared comments. Do you want to come up before we begin the panel and give them? No? You want to hold them? Okay. You sure? Why don't we let you lead off? You can either do a blessing on all of us, which would be appreciated, or...
Let me say what's on all of our minds. God bless you and thank you for the leadership you gave our country and our world. Thank you.
Thank the rest of you.
So, Jonah, Rabbi Pesner is head of the Religious Action Center, and you saw him leading activist Jews pretty recently. This was maybe August of this past year. So he's inspiring the new generation, and we're looking forward to hearing more about your good work. So I want to start with you, Reverend Gerald. You had talked on the film about humanity and getting to know the other. If you could just talk about that. What has inspired you to really dig deeper into relationships and to have, as you say, not only conversations, but true communication?
Yeah, first of all, let me thank Sherry and Sister Bay and all the other panelists for coming here. This has been a long, powerful journey. And as we say, every journey begins with one step. And as we begin to look back over the time, and particularly this is so important now, because America now needs hope. And what you see on this panel and what we've seen in the film and what we've seen over the last 5 decades with Dr. Jones and CT and so many rabbis is hope. We're facing a lot of hopelessness. And we're involved even in Atlanta today with all of the shootings that's going on around the country. And people are in conversations. I'm through conversating. I've been in conversations a long time. I'm ready to communicate now. There's a vast difference, I think, between conversations and communications. I've seen couples who I've counseled, and they're in conversation, but they don't communicate. And communication is predicated upon 3 primary principles, and I think which is germane to what we're talking about here and what we've seen between the African American and the Jewish experience. Communication, in order for us to communicate, we've got to understand each other. We've got to understand each other's stories, understand each other's pains, understand each other's losses. So there has to be a level of understanding, which automatically says we've got to have a desire to understand. Secondly, we've got to, if we can understand each other, we've got to move toward a level of respect. Where there's no respect, there can be no communication. And finally, I think the third point, which is so poignant, Deborah, is that we've got to develop, once again, trust. There was a lot of trust that was going on in the films that we've seen and the conversations that was going on. So the conversation had understanding, it had respect, and it had trust. And I think when we can, once again, generate that kind of dialogue where we begin to seriously understand, we just had at the temple in Atlanta, the Black Jewish Seder, where we talked about the Passover and we were explaining the differences in the culture, we had an understanding, and an understanding gives you an appreciation. And once you have an appreciation for the persons who've gone through the same kind of degradation, then you can respect their pain and their joys, and then you can begin to trust. And I think that that's the essence of what this is all about now, this entire week around the experiences that we've gone through as 2 separate people. So that's what I mean. Communication now. On Channel 2, we had conversations the other night in Unite Atlanta, but there's very little communication because people left and went back to their various camps. We've got to break down that camps by communicating with one another.
Right. So, Rabbi Dresner, if I may, picking up on that theme, when you were involved in the movement, what was the communication like between the two communities? I mean, was there a strategic plan for how you were communicating and walking forward, or it just kind of happened?
I also want to thank the March on Washington Film Festival for inviting me, particularly Shari Rogers, who called me on the phone and asked me if I would come. And lastly, all of you who are here tonight. I was told that I have 7.5 minutes, and I don't know, one of my former congress is supposed to be here.
In a minute, you know.
One of my former congress is supposed to be here. Is Harlan Marks here? No, okay. Yeah, oh, you are, okay. Well, he knows that it's hard for me to say hello in 7.5 minutes. So I'm going to confine myself. I'm going to confine myself to 3 anecdotes with Dr. King. In 1962, Dr. King invited me and a white Methodist minister who I'd been arrested with in the previous year, in 1961, in a freedom ride. Ralph Lord Roy was the name of the white Methodist minister, to come down to Selma, Alabama, where the movement was centered. At that time, that's where I had the pleasure of meeting C.T. Vivian. We came down, and when we got to Selma, when we got to Albany, they pronounced it Albany down there, I remember. It's in southwest Georgia, about 280 miles south of Atlanta, closer to the Florida line and the Alabama line, much closer than to Atlanta. And Dr. King was in jail at the time, along with Ralph Abernathy, and the people who greeted us, Y.T. Walker and Andy Young, they brought us to the jail. And it was the first time I had the pleasure of shaking Dr. King's hand through the bars. And I started talking, as I usually do, but he said, wait a second, and he walked over to the wall separating. He was in a cell with Ralph Abernathy, just the two of them, but next to them was a same-size cell with about 10 young men in it, looked like college students or something. And he knocked on the wall between his cell and the student cell, and they started singing. And then he came back to me and he said, I didn't want anybody to hear what I'm telling you because I don't want it out, I don't want the sheriff to know, I don't want the press to know. I'm coming out on bail at 4 p.m. This was about 11 a.m. in the morning. And I'll never forget, it was the first time I had ever heard one of the freedom songs. I can't sing at all. Every cantor in my congregations loved me because I never interfered and I never competed. So you'll forgive me for singing, because I started crying when they were singing. They sang, oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me, over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. That was the first time I met Dr. King. For the next 4 days in Albany, I followed him around like a little puppy dog. He spoke in little congregations, little churches, in the area in Dawson, Georgia, I remember, and in a place right near Plains, Georgia. I'd never heard of Jimmy Carter at the time, or of Plains. One of the churches in the area had been burned by the Klan. It was a Baptist church, and it was called Mount Hermon Baptist Church. For those of you who know Hebrew here, that are in front of you, it's Har Hermon, is Mount Hermon. It's up in the Golan Heights, and it's covered with snow year-round, even in the summer. And it's the only skiing area in that vicinity. And Dr. King decided to have a funeral service. Oh, it was a second Sunday church, I remember. Do any of you know what that is? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Except for the ministers here. Apparently, there were tiny little congregations all over the South that couldn't afford a full-time minister. And so they would have a minister who came once a month. There was a first Sunday church when they would get a minister. There was a second Sunday when the minister, he was an itinerant preacher. And he would go on every second Sunday, he would go to, Mount Hermon. And every third Sunday, it was an August day in 1962, and we were all schwitzing, and Dr. King pointed two guys in the back who were dressed in suits and shirts and ties and a fedora on their head. That was the male garb of the, with the brim kind of thing. And Dr. King said, FBI, and they're no help whatsoever. And J. Edgar Hoover was not only no help, he was much hindrance. He was a terrible, terrible guy. By the way, Albany is where Ray Charles was born and raised. If you saw the film, Ray, you remember, I think it won an Academy Award a dozen years ago or so. And Dr. King asked me to deliver the invocation. So I stood up and gave an invocation. And then the choir of the church came forward. And they were on the platform that hadn't been burned. And they sang a hymn called John the Baptist Was a Baptist. I was sitting next to Dr. King, and I remember saying to him, no, he wasn't, he was Jewish. Dr. King got up eventually after the choir sang and started his remarks. And he said, I want to commend the choir. They were just wonderful and marvelous, but there was one little error that they made, which Rabbi Dresner pointed out to me. The Baptist Church was not founded until the Reformation in the 16th century, which is 15 centuries after Jesus was killed. John the Baptist wasn't a Baptist, he was Jewish. I'll never forget that. If any of you have been in Ein Kerem, some of you in the first row I know have been there. It's where John the Baptist was born. It's a little suburb of Jerusalem. It's where Hadassah Hospital is. And the third anecdote occurred.
Was it a good song?
It was good. Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm a musical moron. That's why every chazan, every cantor loved me. I mean, because I can't sing on key, boom, boom, etc. I just have a loud voice. That's it. The third anecdote occurred a day and a half later. It was an evening, and we were in the home of W.D. Anderson. Is he here, Shari, or? No. He was the head of the Albany movement. CT would remember. And he was a marvelous, marvelous guy. And he and his wife, and I think he had 2 kids at the time, lived in the black part of Albany. By the way, you knew when the black part of Albany started, there was no pavement, no paving. Mm-hmm. The white part was all paved, and there were no paved streets or sidewalks or anything on the black side. He was the only black doctor. There were 20,000 blacks out of the 50,000 people in Albany. He was the only black doctor. And his house was surrounded by, it must have been dozens of members of the White Citizens Council. They weren't wearing robes or anything. They weren't like, I think the White Citizens Council was sort of a lower middle class Klan or something like that. And they were shouting things like, outside agitators go home, I remember. And I was scared to death. I remember I was sitting there urinating in my pants kind of thing. And in Brooklyn, we said pissing in my pants. And I was brought up in Brooklyn. And Dr. King was cool as a cucumber through the whole thing. And it was the longest single conversation I ever had with him. It must have been 30 minutes where we talked. And he told me that, this was August 1962, he told me that in April 1962, he had been invited to the first Pesach Seder, the first Passover Seder in his life. And he said he was tremendously impressed, particularly because a young boy got up and asked some questions, in Yiddish, the vier kashas, the arba kushiyot, the 4 questions. Why is this night different from all other nights, you know? And he said, and then the family that had invited him began to read from a book, from the Haggadah, and in America pronounced Haggadah, you know. And he said, I was enormously impressed by what the first words. Does anybody other than Susannah and the rabbis remember what the first words in the Haggadah are of the narration after the 4 questions? Avadim hayinu leparo b'mitzrayim. We were slaves unto Pharaoh in Egypt. And Dr. King quoted it to me in English. We were slaves unto Pharaoh in Egypt. And he said to me the following. He said, the Jewish people, 32 centuries later, have not forgotten their slave ancestors. Not only that, you're not ashamed of them. You don't claim to be only the descendants of King David and King Solomon and so forth. Quite the contrary. You're proud of them, of their stick-to-itiveness, their perseverance. They're wanting, their desire, their hope to be free. He said, we Negroes, that was, African American was not the term at the time, we Negroes are not going to forget our slave ancestors. And we're not going to be ashamed of them. We're going to be proud of their perseverance, their heroism, their courage. You don't blame the victim. I conclude, since I have the pleasure of sitting here with Susannah Heschel. In March of 1965, I got a phone call. Remember, March 7th was Black Sunday.
Bloody Sunday.
When they almost killed John Lewis that day, if you remember.
Yeah.
March 9th, 1965 was Turnaround Tuesday. Dr. King had issued a call on March. Dr. King was not there on Black Sunday. He was preaching at Ebenezer Baptist.
Bloody Sunday.
Bloody Sunday, I mean. Bloody Sunday is what I meant. I'm getting old. I'm 87. I'm not in a league with CT. But,
Keep it up. Keep going. Keep going.
And Dr. King led us across the Pettus Bridge. Edmund Pettus was a Confederate general in the Civil War, and he was the second head of the Ku Klux Klan, which was founded after the Civil War. The bridge still bears his name, by the way, to this day. They haven't changed it. And Dr. King stopped us as we crossed the Pettus Bridge. It was the day that Reverend Reeb, the Unitarian minister from Boston, was killed. And Dr. King asked everybody to kneel because we saw the state police that Wallace had ordered out again. And he asked 2 people to deliver a prayer. Ralph Abernathy, the vice president of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he asked me he wanted a non-Christian. And then he turned us around, and a lot of the SNCC kids began to criticize him at that point as an Uncle Tom for selling out. They didn't understand why. When we got back to, what was the name of the chapel? Marshall Chapel?
Brown Chapel.
Brown Chapel. He explained to us that the day before, on the day between Bloody Sunday and Turnaround Tuesday, SCLC had gone to the federal district court to ask them for a ruling prohibiting Governor George Wallace from opposing the march.
That's right.
And the ruling from Judge Johnson came through on the following Wednesday, which was March 7th, 14th, 17th. And Judge Johnson ruled that the state had no business prohibiting a peaceful march, a protest march. And Andy Young called me up the day afterwards. Andy Young was then sort of he had replaced Wyatt T. Walker already. And he said, so I was sort of acting as unofficial liaison between the organized Jewish community and the freedom movement, the civil rights movement. And he said, Cy, we need a Jewish leader to start. No, it was Friday he called me up on, not Thursday. Friday the 19th of March. And he said, we need a Jewish leader to start the march. And I picked up the phone and called Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who I was not a student of his, but we knew each other because we had him for a 2-day seminar up in the Catskills, all the Reform rabbis in the New York area. And I'd met him on 2 other occasions. I was at the National Conference on Religion and Race in January '63 at the Edgewater Beach Hotel. So we'd met before, and I said, Andy Young just called me and said, they need a Jewish leader, will you do it? And he immediately said yes. There was no hesitation, and then he said, I have a problem. I said, what is the problem? He said, I have a problem with Shabbos. He wouldn't travel on the Sabbath. And he said, Wolf will solve the problem. Wolf was Rabbi Wolf Kelman,
all right, so
who was the executive director of all the conservative rabbis.
Okay, so let's hand it off, Rabbi.
I'm really proud. I'm really proud of that because if you remember the march, one person away. Next to Dr. King was Ralph Bunche, who had won the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing Arabs and Jews together in armistice agreements.
So you can understand.
And then with Rabbi Heschel. So.
Thanks. But I mean, I don't think there's nobody in this room, I think, that wouldn't want to stay here all night listening to every single one of these panelists. But so we threw it off here to Susannah. So when this is happening, and you spoke so beautifully in the film about your father's passion, if you could expand on that, what was it when he got that call that made him stand up and act?
So my father had come from Nazi Europe. He said he was like a brand plucked from the fire. He came to this country in March of 1940, and he tried desperately to save his mother, and 3 of his sisters were stuck there, and they were all killed, family, friends. Yeah, I think it's extraordinary that, and I take this as a lesson today. There's a lot of anger in this country, a lot of rage. I understand it. Some of it is justified. The question is, what do we do with the anger, with the rage, even that which is justified? And the lesson I take from my father is, never turn the anger into resentment. And that's what I'm afraid we're seeing today, a lot of resentment, angry resentment. That's very dangerous. We've seen it before in history. I'm teaching this summer at Dartmouth a course in German Jewish history. And every day in my class, and I talk about German history, I think, my God, am I seeing it all happening again? There are too many parallels. We have to be careful. I would say what I'm grateful for is that after what happened, that was really quite extraordinary, unbelievable that 6 million Jews were killed in a very short period of time, that European Judaism was destroyed. We were lost as Jews. I say the civil rights movement saved our souls. It saved Jews from becoming like some of these people we saw this week in Cleveland. I'm in Cleveland, Ohio, at that convention. It has saved so many of us, and at least offered us the opportunity to remember what it is to be a Jew. And my father said, Judaism comes as a religion of dissent. We dissent. And we dissent when we see injustice. That's what it's about. And yes, it's true. How many people in antiquity talk about their origins as slaves? People talk about, oh, we originated as kings, as gods, as sons of gods. Who says this? You know, the pagan writer Kelsa said, slaves? You start as slaves? That's a frog and rainworm's perspective on the world. It's ridiculous. And yet, no, it means something. It means that we dissent from this prevailing rage and resentment and the politics that are derived from it. And the civil rights movement gave us back the Bible, gave us back the prophets, gave us something to stand for as Jews and to feel good about. My father felt with Dr. King that they were united by their faith in God. They were united by the Bible. That was extraordinary. Think what that meant for my father to come from Nazi Germany, where the Christian theologians threw the Old Testament out of the Bible because it was a Jewish book and said Jesus wasn't a Jew, he was an Aryan, and Hitler's doing what Jesus wanted. And he comes to this country and he meets Dr. King, and the Exodus is the central motif of the civil rights movement. That's extraordinary. The civil rights movement gave us back our Judaism and saved our souls. And I just want to conclude with one story, which is about Dr. Jackson. We saw the home in the film that Sherry made in Selma, the home of Dr. and Mrs. Sullivan Jackson. You remember him as you stayed there. He was a dentist in Selma. My father went there. Actually, I don't know if it was the phone call, because I remember the telegram coming that day before the Selma March, and it was a Friday afternoon, and it was a very nervous Shabbat, and when the Sabbath was over, I remember walking my father downstairs, and he kissed me goodbye, and he got in a taxi, and he went to the airport, and I didn't know if he'd come back, because Bloody Sunday was scary. But he went there, and he stayed overnight at the home of the Jacksons, which is where the headquarters in Selma, and Dr. King had been there for months, and Mrs. Jackson told me that the morning of the march in Selma, she woke up, she went into the living room, and that Sunday morning, she saw Dr. King praying in one side of the living room. My father was praying in the other side of the living room. There were other priests, ministers praying in the dining room. It was quiet, and everyone was praying in their living room. And I think that was extraordinary. What an extraordinary thing to witness. And that's what the civil rights movement did for all of us also. For that, I'm very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you. I need that.
So Dr. Vivian, do you want to pick up on those themes of shared oppression and overcoming together?
You know, what I really like, because you've got to continue this. This is great stuff. Where are the parallels? And we're talking about forever, the parallels. And when I really think about them, is that the slave always, the former slaves always looked for a leader. You did not. You never stopped dealing with the Moses. You never stopped seeing the people that were basic to your religion. And you brought them with you. You didn't have to look for them, right? And you kept it a constant set of taking it all down the road. You know all your history, right? Now, see, this is, and we imitate. I mean, we use it. We preach it all the time. We preach it probably more than you do. Is that because there's more preachers than and you're always waiting for that leader that is going to go beyond, right? Is that this is what we were doing when Martin King came on the scene. The idea somebody asked me today, what was the greatest moment for me personally within the civil rights movement? And to me and my wife, And that's something we forget who their wives were, right? We forget that the people, civil rights people, even have these wives. Right? And the idea was that when we met Martin, the wife and I had both, though, lived in different places. She was in Pontiac, Michigan. I was in Peoria, Illinois. And Macomb, Illinois. I was in Illinois. In spite of that, we were both doing the same thing. We were involved in nonviolence at least 12 years before Montgomery, right? But so the big question for me, and the wonderful thing about Martin and for my wife, was the fact that we knew when we heard him that he was what we had been waiting for. Just like you waited for a Moses or et cetera, or the kings in the series, all right? We were looking for a leader, all right? We knew what we wanted to do, but we could not do it, and it was for violence that we could not do it. And here comes a man that says nonviolence, already starting something that was going to be basic to us from now on, all right? We will be dead when it's a whole cycle. Who cares? The point is, and that's the thing about the Old Testament to me, we're looking at centuries of stuff, right? And you're still following day by day, week by week, to make your faith the faith that it could be, should be, was and was not here and there, but became on a consistent basis what it should be. This is where we are now. When I see a Martin King was the follow-through of what we really wanted. When I go into that Martin's church, his father's church, right? Daddy King, as we call it, and Martin King, PhD, right? And I see up in the one corner, you see his son. You see his grandfather, and of his wife, really, all right? And he was the man who started the church. And you look in the other corner, and there was Daddy King, and he kept it going. And there's no one in the middle, but I have a picture that I got from you, all right, of Martin praying in that middle part, and and it remind me of a third generation kind of thing, right? Is that Adam Clayton Powell was the same way. About every third generation, we came forward with a great leader, right? Is that each one of them was a third generation person. Now, is that I see that Gandhi brought nonviolence to the West, to the East. Is that Martin King has brought it to the West, yes. Right? And I was in Rio, had nothing to do with the Olympics, but I was giving a speech about nonviolence, but I had to leave, and these students just got up and followed me out and right down the steps and one waiting for a cab, right? Is that because they want to do the same thing. What I'm saying is that we're part of a major cycle. And what the too young miss is the fact that we're in a long-term struggle. And what Jews have always understood, they were in a long-term struggle, right? Is that, and that you remain faithful to it, right? And so right now is what when we see these new young black kids come forward, right? and people, they speak it, and people don't understand what they're saying. This is white people don't understand what they're meaning, and as a result of that, we got the conflict. But how do we make it come around? But it takes the time to then go to a South America and begin to make the whole circuit. So mankind becomes to use what we're talking about, right? Yeah. And our relationship with Jews, though not as personal as it might be, but we're preaching it all the time, right? And in fact, actually, we preach more of the Old Testament than we do of the New Testament, right? I don't like that, because I want quickly to get to love, because that is nonviolence, right? And if you keep preaching about love, you can most easily deal with nonviolence, and you can take it on to the next step, and the next step will be fulfilling a circuit. And as soon as Gandhi left, they try to forget Gandhi, right? But there were scholars that made certain that all India knew. We look at where we are is that people want to forget nonviolence. The new kids do, right? Now let's see what we can do to make them effective, all right, and not forget that Martin King started it again for us, right? And I like what you said, because he started again for us, all of us, all right? So that we're not talking about a piece of, separate from, we're talking about a piece of that's involved in all of us, bringing the love and the truth and the justice. The only three words to me is love, truth, and justice, right? And you filled it in with justice, so I should use it second, right? But when we really deal with it, we're looking at a way to bring us all together, because we fought the civil rights movement together, right? And then there was a period in there where that we lost each other, right? And a Jewish fellow was leading a group that I was speaking to, told me, says, oh, you're worried about that. Says, don't worry about it, because we don't need you anymore. Now the problem.
So I pause. I'm going to have to enter. I'm getting the signals. Again, this is so frustrating, because I'd love to.
Just one line.
One line. Okay.
Bless
you.
The
bless
point,
everybody.
Yeah. But the point being is we are a part of an ongoing cycle that may be larger than we think, but it is the fulfillment of all of our ancestors, and will fulfill our need as human beings to really love and care for one another.
It's beautiful. So I know Dr. Durley wanted to follow up on that, but then real quickly, and then I would like to hear the perspectives of Rabbi Pesner and Clarence Jones, because as you saw in the film, they are really impacting that next generation. And it'd be interesting to hear your perspectives on how you take these lessons and are really doing that work.
30 seconds. For the last several weeks, I've been in cities around the country with the Black Lives Matters movement, and Ferguson and other places. And then I come to places like this, as all of us have been involved. Certainly, Dr. Heschel, when you're teaching, and it's so critical when we talk about spill the honey, and I said at the end of the film, something that sweetens something that's so negative and so nasty. What makes this important tonight, the film and all of us being here together, is as CT was saying, how do we come back together? And that comes with what we started with. How do we begin to communicate this? Tonight is only as important as we become individual beacons of light to communicate with our young people, to begin to get them to understand the various histories, and then to respect the differences in the culture, that the differences make us strong, and then get the respect, and then we can begin to trust. That's what's missing. And when that comes together, the one missing ingredient is all of this. And this is what I think all of this is about. How do we engender hope? I've often said black folks feel hopeless and white folks feel helpless. And if we can, what do we do? How do we do it? And if we can get past the helplessness and the hopelessness, we've got an opportunity to make a difference. Thank you.
So Rabbi Pesner, how do we do it?
Well, the only thing that I would add, as a leader of the largest denomination in Jewish life, the Reformed Jewish movement, we are a movement of people who mostly weren't born on Bloody Sunday. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was drafted in the conference room of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, the Reform Movement Social Justice offices just a mile or two that way. But most Reformed Jews, most Jews in America were not born in 1964. And so the question that we're asking ourselves is what will galvanize, mobilize, and organize this generation of Jews and African Americans and the broad array of God's children, because the truth is that this presidential election will be the first since the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was eviscerated. And though we know that Jim Crow has gone, there is a new Jim Crow. And so we are having, in the Jewish community, a movement-wide conversation about the new Jim Crow. We are reading Ta-Nehisi Coates. We are reading Bryan Stevenson. We are reaching across lines of difference, across neighborhood, across the usual gaps that divide us, and trying to foster not just conversation, not just communication, but organization. Because Dr. King did say, love without power is sentimental, and it becomes irrelevant. Right. And so the danger, the beauty of the movie is to inspire us and agitate us with our history. The danger is we get sentimental about it. And for a generation who didn't live through it, we say, oh, that's so nice. We don't just need the love, we also need the power to make change. And so we are working, so my favorite part, I'll stop talking, but my favorite part of the movie, there's so many amazing, amazing parts, but if you saw the NAACP's American Journey for Justice, right, where thousands and thousands and thousands of folk marched from Selma to Washington last summer because our lives matter and our votes must count, when Cornell Brooks, Reverend Brooks, who's the president of NAACP, called us and said, do you think we could get some rabbis to carry the Torah from Selma to Washington? We thought, well, the journey was going to be 40 days and 40 nights, a good biblical number, right, Rabbi Dresner? We thought, could we get 40 rabbis to come? We put out the call. More than 200 rabbis brought hundreds and hundreds of young people and members of their congregations to march hand in hand because they are angry and they are frustrated that votes are not being counted and that mostly black folk are victims of mass incarceration. I, as a white man, have a 1 in 17 shot of going to jail. If I were a black man, it would be a 1 in 3 shot. So we need to organize and mobilize and not just live in the nostalgia of our history, but to build the power to transform the history that is before us.
Thank you. So I think it's fitting we give Dr. Jones some of the final words for the program.
I think thank you. The takeaway of the film and the lesson I think that is appropriate today is that power concedes nothing without a demand. And that the reason that the African American and Jewish community was able to end American apartheid by transforming the soul of America was because the two communities came together and they
shared and understood a commonality of necessity. And that necessity was to all of the Jewish people that I knew that came into the movement, they intuitively as well as ideologically understood that unless racial segregation ended, unless Negroes, as we referred to as that time, were free, ultimately, they would not be free. They would have the illusion of freedom, but they would not have substantive freedom. And so the takeaway for us today is, first of all, we have to acknowledge a reality of what's going on in America, in our countries. We can't shy away from something. I live in Palo Alto, California. It's supposed to be the brightest people out there with technology and so forth. There seems to be like a disconnect that I see across the nation. What's that disconnect? The disconnect is, I don't care whether it's in Washington, D.C., or Baltimore, or Palo Alto in California, is that never since 1960, never since the period of the Civil Rights Movement, have I seen such a rise in resentment between a significant segment of the African American community, mainly young people, and the police in our country. Now, there's no way you can talk around it and avoid it. It is a reality. And when you say that, doesn't mean you're anti-police. It means that if you're really interested in dealing with social justice today in 2016, you have to address the issue. It is the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that young black men across this nation
being murdered,
are being killed because the police exercise as a first option in effecting an arrest lethal force rather than the use of a subsequent option. Now, that's what's happening in America today. That's the reality. And so, I say again, there's a challenge to white people. But you can't teach an old dog new tricks. So I don't mean to offend white people who are not Jewish. I don't mean to say that. I don't mean to say anything about white people who were not Jewish. But out of my experience, out of my experience, okay, I'm ringing the bell. I'm saying, I'm pleading with you. I'm pleading with you to do today what you did for us and with us in 1960. Otherwise, this country is not going to remain as it is. Or putting it bluntly, in my judgment, there's never been a time except today that came as close to where we were. When you read the history, they won't tell you what really was going on in 1968.
Well,
they won't tell you. The closest period after 1865 where this country was just beneath the surface of civil war. They won't tell you that. But that's really what was going on between the combination of the young people who were just enraged about Vietnam and got sick and tired of what was happening in our country with respect to civil rights. So the takeaway is, shared legacy. So, someone said to me, Professor Jones, I thought you knew better. I heard you say something about you seem to be in support of Black Lives Matter movement. I said, well, let me put it in the way I want you to understand. All the Black Lives Matter young people are saying is that pay attention once and for all, because what's been happening to us is that you have not treated young men with respect to what's happening with the police like their lives matter. That's all. It's not that white lives don't matter. It's just like black lives have to be something important. But let me tell you historically what you should understand what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. Listen to me carefully. If black lives don't matter, if black lives don't matter in America, neither will white lives. You hear what I'm saying?
Poor white won't matter.
If African Americans cannot be free of excessive police force, you will not have tranquility in this country. There's a choice. America has to be prepared to deal with this insidious virus of excessive force, or it will be ungovernable. I don't care whether Hillary Clinton's elected. I don't care whether Trump is elected. The country will will become ungovernable unless we have the courage to recognize what's taking place and to talk honestly about it. Thank you.
What does CT stand for?
Coordinating
Wow.
Canada.
So I'd like to end. There's another portion of the program. We're going to move. There's a musical presentation. But I was rereading. I was so moved by Louis Gossett's reading of Birmingham letter. And when I speak about civil rights around the country, I often quote from Dr. King's March on Washington speech. And so the words that I now know that Clarence Jones drafted, I want to say here as I conclude this program. Dr. King said, "We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy." Thank you all for joining us.
See if I'm right.
Do you want us to come down?
Please stand and take a photograph.
Oh.
A few more moments. I've heard people say, and I agree, I don't want to be a part of a movement that has no music. And so, or Dizzy Gillespie said, no, it wasn't Dizzy, Duke Ellington, don't mean a thing if it ain't got, there you go. I'm Isa Sarabay, I'm executive producer of the March on Washington Film Festival. We are so gratified to have you, and we hope you will indulge us 5 more minutes as we cap this evening with some music. We'll be hearing from Yvette Spears, who's a mezzo-soprano with Herman Burney, upright bass, followed by the Temple Micah Cantors, Rabbi Susan Landau, Cantor Merrill Weiner, and music director Teddy Klaus. So please bear with us, and we will close our evening with song. Thank you.
black body swinging, the southern breeze, strange feet hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes, the twisted mouth, scent of magnolias, so sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here's a strange and bitter pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolias, so then the smell of burning flesh. Is a fruit for crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to sing, for the sun to rot, for the trees to die. Is a strange and bitter
Thank you so much for having us. It's a privilege to close this powerful evening with a prayer. We'll sing Oseh Shalom, our continuous prayer for peace, our continuous fight for peace, and we pray that we continue to be God's partners in this work and partners with each other to make peace. Oseh Shalom. Please join in when you can. Oseh Shalom, Shalom Bimroma.
shalom. Hu ya'aseh shalom. Hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel. Oh, say shalom, shalom bimromav. Yaseh shalom. Hu ya'aseh shalom. Hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'emeru amen. Oh, say shalom, shalom bimromav. Yaseh shalom. Oh, say shalom, shalom bimromav. Yaseh